The nurse had always prided herself on the care she provided, treating each patient with compassion and dedication. She had been working at the hospital for several years, long enough to understand the importance of not just treating the body, but caring for the heart and mind as well. Her reputation was built on her unwavering commitment to those she helped, and it was this very trait that set her apart from others in the field. One rainy morning, a new patient arrived in the ward. His name, as recorded in the hospital files, was Mr. Bennett, but to the nurse he was just another person in need of care, someone who deserved the same compassion as anyone else. As she walked into his room for the first time, she noticed how quiet the space felt. The dim lighting, combined with the rain tapping softly against the windows, created a serene but somber atmosphere. Mr. Bennett was lying in his bed, staring out the window, seemingly lost in thought. He was in his early 40s, his face showing the wear of someone who had lived a full life, but had recently been struck with a great tragedy. His eyes, though, were a mystery. They were distant, as though they had seen too much and had no intention of seeing any more. The nurse approached with a gentle smile, hoping to offer a sense of comfort even though she couldn't predict how he would respond. Many patients in his condition felt anger, frustration, or even hopelessness. She had seen it all before. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett," she said softly, her voice warm and welcoming. "How are you feeling today?" He didn't immediately respond. For a moment it felt as though she was speaking to a wall. His gaze remained fixed outside, his mind seemingly miles away. She stood there for a few seconds, waiting. When she didn't receive an answer, she gently touched the edge of his bed. "I'll be taking care of you today," she said, her voice calm. "Is there anything you need right now?" He turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. They were deep, full of thought, yet distant. There was a flicker of something, perhaps recognition, perhaps a question, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. "I don't need anything," he replied in a low voice. His tone was flat, emotionless, almost as if he had given up on everything around him. The nurse nodded, taking a seat beside him. She had learned long ago that silence could be just as powerful as words. She wasn't going to push him, but she wasn't going to leave him alone either. She would stay there, even if it meant simply sitting in quiet company. She understood that in some cases, the act of being present was the most important thing she could do. Over the next few days, their interactions followed the same pattern. She would come in, ask if he needed anything, and he would offer little more than a few quiet words or a glance in her direction. But she was persistent, refusing to let his silence define their relationship. She knew that underneath the surface he was going through something painful, something much bigger than the physical trauma of his accident. He had been paralyzed from the waist down, but his emotional wounds ran deeper than anything she could see. One afternoon, as she was helping him adjust in bed, she noticed something different. For the first time, he made eye contact with her in a way that seemed almost purposeful, as though he was truly seeing her. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but still, no words. The nurse had been trained to read people, to understand their needs without always having to hear them expressed. But this was new. She could sense there was something more to him, something he wasn't willing to share yet. She smiled at him gently, trying to reassure him without overstepping. "You're doing well with the exercises," she said, keeping her tone light. "The more you practice, the easier it will get." He looked down at his hand, still gripping the bed's railing. "I don't see the point," he muttered quietly, barely above a whisper. "What's the use in trying?" The nurse didn't flinch at his words. She knew that many patients in his situation felt like giving up at first. It was normal. It didn't make it any easier, but it was something she had seen many times before. She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but firm. "The point is that every small step you take brings you closer to regaining control. It might not seem like much now, but every bit of effort counts." There was a long pause. He didn't respond, but this time she didn't mind. The silence felt different. It wasn't the kind of silence that was filled with defeat. It felt more like a pause, as though he was processing her words. After a while, he finally spoke again, but it wasn't about his condition. It was about something else entirely. "I used to run a company," he said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "I was in charge of everything. I had a life, a future." His words were slow, as though he was struggling to recall the life he had before the accident. The nurse nodded, listening intently. She didn't interrupt him. She didn't push him to talk more than he wanted to, but she could tell that this was the first time he had opened up about his past. "Things change," she said simply. "Life can take unexpected turns, but that doesn't mean it's over." For the first time, a faint trace of emotion crossed his face, a flicker of something that resembled hope. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there. She couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment, knowing that she had somehow reached him, even if just for a moment. As the days passed, their routine continued, with the nurse caring for him, helping with his physical therapy, and offering him a kind word whenever he needed it. She could tell that his emotional walls were slowly starting to crack, but she never pushed him to open up. She knew that healing, both physical and emotional, would take time, and she was willing to give it to him no matter how long it took. But even as she continued to help him, she had no idea who he truly was. To her, he was simply Mr. Bennett, a patient in need of care. Little did she know, the man lying in that hospital bed was someone far more significant than she could have ever imagined. Days turned into weeks, and as time passed, the nurse's connection with her patient, Mr. Bennett, continued to grow. She could see little changes in him every day, even if he didn't always notice them himself. He was still mostly quiet, but every now and then, he would engage in a brief conversation, sharing fragments of his past or expressing frustration over his situation. Yet those moments felt significant, like small victories in a long and uncertain battle. The nurse noticed that he was beginning to take more of an interest in his therapy sessions. His resistance, which had been so strong at first, was gradually easing. He had started attempting the exercises on his own, even if it was just for a few minutes each day. It wasn't much, but for someone who had been paralyzed and had lost so much control over his own body, it was progress. The nurse made sure to acknowledge every effort, no matter how small, offering praise and encouragement to motivate him further. One morning, she entered his room to find him attempting to lift his hand from the bed, his brow furrowed in concentration. The nurse could see that he was pushing himself beyond his usual limits, his frustration evident in the way his body tensed with effort. She approached him gently, her presence a reminder that he wasn't alone in his struggle. "You're doing great," she said, her tone soft but confident. "You're getting stronger with every try." Mr. Bennett gave her a look that she had come to recognize as his version of a smile, a subtle shift in his expression that hinted at something positive underneath the surface. "I don't feel great," he muttered, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "It feels like I'm fighting a battle I'm not winning." The nurse nodded, understanding the sentiment all too well. "Sometimes it feels like that. But you are winning. You just don't see it yet." She helped him reposition himself in bed, her hands moving with practiced ease. As she worked, he seemed lost in thought, his eyes distant again. She could tell that he was reflecting on the journey he had been through, not just physically, but emotionally as well. There was so much about him that she didn't know, and yet she felt like she was starting to understand him in ways that even he might not fully comprehend. Over the next few weeks, the nurse found herself spending more time with Mr. Bennett, outside of just his therapy sessions. She'd sit with him during meals, even though he rarely spoke much, just to keep him company. She would read to him from books he had no interest in but appreciated the gesture. Slowly but surely, their routine became a comforting constant in his life. One afternoon, as she was helping him with a new therapy exercise, he spoke again, his voice quieter than usual. "You know, I used to think I had everything figured out," he said, his eyes looking down at his hands. "I was in control. I ran things. But now it feels like I'm not in control of anything." The nurse paused, giving him space to continue, even if she had no idea where he was going with it. After a long moment, he spoke again, his voice softer this time. "I had a family, a life, a company, but now it's all gone. I'm just a man in a bed waiting for time to pass." His words cut through the silence, hanging in the air between them. The nurse could see the pain in his eyes, a kind of sorrow that went deeper than the physical pain he was enduring. It was the grief of losing everything he had worked for, everything he thought defined him. She sat down beside his bed, close enough to offer support, but without intruding. "I can't imagine what that's like," she said gently. "But I do know that you're not just a man in a bed. You're someone who has fought through a lot already, and you're still here. That matters." He didn't respond right away, but after a while he nodded slightly. She could tell that her words had struck a chord with him, even if he wasn't ready to admit it. The next day, something unexpected happened. The nurse was going over his therapy schedule when Mr. Bennett surprised her by asking for a change. "I want to try a different exercise today," he said, his voice more determined than it had been in weeks. The nurse looked at him, surprised by the sudden shift in attitude. "Are you sure? The one we've been doing is important for your recovery." He nodded. "I know, but I need to do something else. I need to feel like I'm actually moving forward." There was a spark in his eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. She could see the desire to regain some sense of control, to fight back against the limitations that his body had placed on him. She agreed to change the routine, knowing that sometimes small changes in approach could make all the difference in a patient's recovery. As they worked together on the new exercise, the nurse couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of hope for him. It wasn't just about the physical movements. It was about his mindset, the way he was beginning to see his situation differently. She had witnessed it time and time again with other patients. Sometimes, the first step in healing was the decision to keep moving, even when it seemed like there was no reason to. Days passed, and Mr. Bennett continued to show progress. He started asking more questions about his recovery, wanting to understand the exercises better and what they would do for him in the long run. The nurse could see that he was becoming more invested in his healing, and it made all the difference in his recovery. Yet despite this progress, there were still moments when his old self would slip through, the moments when he would retreat into his shell, closing off from the world around him. The nurse didn't push him to talk when he wasn't ready, but she knew that it was only a matter of time before he would open up more. There was something about him, something beneath the surface that made her believe in his ability to come through this stronger than before. One evening, after the day's therapy had ended, the nurse was preparing to leave for the day when she heard Mr. Bennett speak again. His voice was softer this time, almost hesitant. "You know," he said, "I never expected to be here. I never thought I'd end up like this." She turned around, surprised to hear him speak again. "You don't have to go through this alone," she said, her voice gentle. "I'm here. We're all here to help." He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the nurse wondered if he would say anything more. Then, just as quickly as he had started speaking, he fell silent as if the words had left him. It was an unusual conversation, but the nurse understood. Sometimes it was just enough to be present, to offer someone the space to speak or remain silent as needed. She had seen this happen many times with other patients. Healing wasn't always a straight line. It came in waves, and every small step forward mattered. As she left the room that evening, the nurse felt a small but powerful shift within herself. She had been giving her all to Mr. Bennett, but in doing so, she had learned something important about herself too. She had learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone isn't just your care. It's your belief in their ability to get better, even when they can't see it themselves. As the weeks turned into months, the bond between the nurse and Mr. Bennett grew stronger. What had begun as a simple professional relationship had developed into something far deeper. She had seen him through the toughest moments, his frustration, his moments of despair, and the times when he was ready to give up. But she also saw his quiet determination, his small victories that no one else seemed to notice. It wasn't just about physical recovery anymore. It was about regaining a sense of self, a sense of purpose. And the nurse was with him every step of the way, offering support when he needed it and stepping back when he needed space. One afternoon, Mr. Bennett asked if they could talk privately. The nurse was used to their routine, where conversation was minimal, and most of their time was spent focusing on exercises or daily care. But today, something in his voice made her stop. There was a weight in his words, a hesitation that made her feel that something important was coming. She nodded and sat down beside his bed. "Of course, Mr. Bennett. What's on your mind?" He was quiet for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. The silence stretched between them, but she didn't rush him. She had learned that sometimes patience was the most important thing she could offer. After a long pause, he spoke. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he began, his voice low and contemplative, "about everything. about my life before the accident and how much I took for granted. The nurse listened closely, sensing that he was finally opening up in a way he hadn't before. She remained quiet, letting him take the lead in the conversation. I was so focused on my company, on being successful, he continued. I thought that was all that mattered. But now I realize how much I missed, how much I lost. His eyes drifted to the window, where the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow across the room. It was as if he was seeing the world for the first time, not just from the physical limitations of his body, but from the emotional distance he had kept for so long. The nurse could sense the depth of his regret, but she also knew that regret wasn't the end of the story. There was more to him than the man who had once been consumed by his work. It's natural to look back and wonder what might have been, she said softly. But what matters now is how you move forward. You have the chance to start a new chapter, one where you can find a different kind of purpose. He looked at her then, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, a faint spark of hope. You really believe that? He asked, his voice almost vulnerable. The nurse smiled gently. I believe in you, she said simply. I believe that you can find a new purpose, even if it's not the one you expected. For a moment, he didn't say anything, but the nurse could see the wheels turning in his mind, the shift happening quietly inside him. This was the moment when everything changed, when the patient stopped just surviving and started living again, and the nurse had been there for him, guiding him without pushing, supporting him without overwhelming him. Over the next few weeks, Mr. Bennett's attitude began to change. He was still the same person, quiet, reserved, but now there was a hint of something new, a desire to engage, to learn, to explore what his future could look like beyond the confines of his hospital room. The nurse watched as he slowly but surely started to take charge of his recovery in ways he hadn't before. He asked more questions about his exercises, about how to push himself further, about what he could do to speed up his healing process. It was as though the fog had lifted, and he was seeing things clearly for the first time in a long while. But there were still moments when he would retreat back into his shell. There were still times when the weight of everything he had lost would come crashing down on him. The nurse understood this. Healing wasn't linear. Some days were better than others, and while she was happy to see him making progress, she knew that there would be setbacks along the way. One afternoon, as the nurse was assisting him with his physical therapy, he asked a question that caught her off guard. Do you ever wonder why people like me end up in situations like this? He asked, his voice tinged with frustration. The nurse paused, considering his question carefully. It wasn't an easy one to answer. People often asked why bad things happened to good people, why tragedies struck when they were least expected, but she had learned over the years that there were no easy answers to those kinds of questions. I think, she began slowly, that sometimes life just happens. We can't always control what happens to us, but we can control how we respond to it. And I think you've already shown how strong you are just by getting through each day. Mr. Bennett didn't respond right away. He simply nodded, though she could tell that he wasn't entirely convinced by her answer. It was a tough pill to swallow. The idea that life didn't always make sense, that things didn't always happen for a reason. But the nurse wasn't about to give up on him. She had seen too many people rise from their lowest points to believe that someone like him couldn't do the same. As the days went by, the nurse continued to support him, but she also noticed something else. He had started to take an interest in the world outside of the hospital. She would often catch him watching the news on his phone, reading about business developments, or keeping track of trends in the industry he had once been a part of. It was as if he was trying to reconnect with a part of his life that he had abandoned, a part that was still very much a part of who he was. One afternoon, as she was helping him with some light stretching exercises, he mentioned something that surprised her. I've been thinking about getting back into business, he said casually, as though the idea had only just occurred to him. Maybe not the way I used to, but I think I could still make a difference. The nurse looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. Are you serious? She asked, unable to hide the amazement in her voice. He smiled faintly. I think it's time to find out. I'm not sure what the next step is, but I feel like I need to try. For myself. For the first time, she saw a real spark of determination in him, the same fire that had once driven him to build an empire. It wasn't the same, not exactly, but it was a start, and that was enough for the nurse. She had seen people come back from worse, and she had no doubt that Mr. Bennet had the strength to find his way forward. I think that's a great idea, she said, her voice filled with encouragement. Whatever you choose to do, I'm here to help. You don't have to figure it all out on your own. He nodded, and for the first time in a long while, he looked at her with a sense of appreciation. Thank you, he said, his voice sincere. I don't think I would have even thought about it if you hadn't been here. She smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't just about helping him with his physical recovery anymore. It was about helping him rediscover who he was, who he could be. And that, to her, was the most meaningful part of her job. The weeks that followed Mr. Bennet's decision to re-enter the world of business were filled with small yet significant changes. His focus had shifted from the bleakness of his current situation to the possibilities of his future. He was no longer just a man in a bed, but someone who was beginning to see a new direction in life. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but every day he made strides toward reclaiming control over his life in a way that felt genuine. The nurse noticed the change in him almost immediately. He was more engaged in their conversations, asking about new developments in the business world and keeping up with trends and opportunities. He started discussing ideas for projects, things he once would have dismissed as too small or unimportant. The man who had once been all about the big picture, the grand gestures, was now thinking about the small details, about how he could rebuild his life one step at a time. Despite his newfound optimism, there were moments when he still doubted himself. It was impossible to erase the scars of the past, and the nurse could see the uncertainty that would creep into his mind when the weight of his loss became too much to bear. But these moments were fewer and further between. The more he worked on his recovery, the more confident he became. He was starting to believe in the idea that he could make something of himself again, even if it wasn't the life he had planned. One afternoon, as the nurse was helping him with his daily exercises, he suddenly spoke up. He said, his voice quieter than usual. I've been thinking about what you said the other day, about moving forward and finding a new purpose. The nurse paused, giving him her full attention. What about it? I think I've been afraid to let go of the past, he continued, his tone thoughtful. I was so attached to the life I had before the accident. But maybe it's time to let go of that version of myself. She nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. It was difficult to accept that a part of your life was over, but it was equally important to recognize that letting go could open up the possibility of something better. It's not about forgetting who you were, she said gently. It's about accepting where you are now and using that to build something new. He looked at her, and for the first time the nurse saw a shift in his eyes. There was no longer just sadness or regret there, but a glimmer of hope. It wasn't just about recovery anymore. It was about embracing the possibility of a new life, something that was entirely his own. I think I'm ready to try, he said slowly, as if the words themselves were new to him. Not just for me, but for everyone who's helped me get this far. The nurse smiled, a sense of pride swelling in her chest. She had seen him at his lowest, and now she was seeing him rise from the ashes of his former self. It wasn't an easy journey, and it certainly wasn't over, but she knew that this was a turning point. He was no longer just surviving. He was starting to live again. As the weeks went on, Mr. Bennet became more proactive in his recovery. He started attending more therapy sessions, determined to push himself harder each day. He also began researching ways to use his knowledge and experience to help others, focusing on mentoring younger entrepreneurs who had faced similar setbacks. He was starting to see that success didn't have to come in the form of a huge business empire. It could be about making a difference in someone else's life, using his skills to help others achieve their dreams. The nurse was impressed by his transformation. She had always believed in his potential, but seeing him take control of his life was something different. It was a reminder that people were capable of far more than they gave themselves credit for, and for the first time in a long while, Mr. Bennet was beginning to believe it too. One evening, after a particularly tough therapy session, Mr. Bennet asked the nurse to sit with him for a moment. He was tired, and the effort of the day had drained him, but there was something he needed to say. "Thank you," he said quietly, looking at her with a sincerity that made her heart swell. "I don't know if I could have done this without you." The nurse was taken aback, surprised by the weight of his words. She had always considered her job to be just that, a job. But this was different. This wasn't just about taking care of a patient. It was about building a connection with someone, helping them find the strength within themselves to move forward. "You've done all the hard work," she replied, her voice soft but filled with admiration. "I've just been here to guide you when you needed it." Mr. Bennett shook his head slightly. "You've done more than that. You've made me believe in myself again." Her eyes softened. "That's all I've ever wanted for you, to believe that you could get through this no matter what." He nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. For a moment they simply sat there, allowing the silence to speak for itself. It was a quiet acknowledgement of everything they had been through together. They both knew that the journey wasn't over, but for the first time the end didn't feel so far away. In the days that followed, Mr. Bennett took even more steps toward rebuilding his life. He reached out to former colleagues, reconnected with old contacts, and began to make plans for the future. But through it all, he never forgot the nurse who had been there for him when he was at his lowest. She had helped him rediscover his purpose, and now, he was determined to use that to make a difference in the world. One afternoon, as the nurse was preparing to leave for the day, Mr. Bennett surprised her with a gesture that took her completely off guard. He had arranged for a small lunch with a few of his business associates, people he hadn't spoken to in months. It wasn't much, but it was a sign that he was beginning to rebuild his network, one step at a time. "I wanted you to be there," he said, looking up at her with a grateful expression. "You've been a huge part of this journey, and I can't thank you enough." The nurse felt a swell of emotion in her chest. She hadn't expected this, and she wasn't sure how to respond, but she smiled, touched by his gesture. "I'm honored," she said simply. "But remember, this is your journey. I'm just glad I could be a part of it." As she left the room that evening, she felt a sense of pride in her heart. It wasn't just about the physical recovery, though that was important. It was about the person Mr. Bennett had become, the man who had learned to believe in himself again, who had found a new purpose in life. She had watched him grow from a man who had lost everything to someone who was starting over, with hope and determination in his eyes. And for the first time in a long time, the nurse realized that her job was about more than just caring for patients. It was about making a difference in their lives, helping them discover the strength they didn't know they had. She had done that for Mr. Bennett, and in doing so had helped him rebuild his life. That, she knew, was the greatest reward of all. The months that followed were a whirlwind of changes for Mr. Bennett. The once quiet, reclusive man who had been confined to a hospital bed was now stepping back into the world with renewed purpose. He had slowly but surely rebuilt his life, not to return to the life he once knew, but to create something entirely new, a life that aligned with who he had become through his journey. The nurse, who had been by his side every step of the way, saw these changes firsthand. She had witnessed the darkness that had overtaken him when he first arrived, the bitterness that seemed to seep into everything he said and did. But now she saw a man who had started to embrace hope, a man who had found a new direction and a renewed sense of purpose. It was an incredible transformation, and she felt privileged to have been part of it. One afternoon, after a particularly successful therapy session, Mr. Bennett sat in his room, looking out of the window with a thoughtful expression. The nurse, who had come to check on him, noticed the change in his demeanor. There was a calmness in him now, a sense of peace that hadn't been there before. He had always been a man who had been driven by ambition and the need to prove himself, but now there was something more grounded in his approach to life. The nurse stood at the door for a moment, watching him before gently knocking to let him know she was there. He turned toward her with a soft smile, the kind that made his whole face light up. "Hi," he said, his voice carrying a sense of tranquility that had been absent in the past. "Hi," she replied, walking over to him. "How are you feeling today?" "I'm good," he said, his tone genuine. "I've been thinking a lot about the future, about everything that's happened." The nurse nodded, sitting down beside him. "It's a lot to think about, I'm sure, but you've come so far." He smiled again, the warmth in his eyes evident. "I know, and I never thought I'd get here, but here I am. There was a moment of silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence that held the weight of everything they had both experienced together. A silence that said more than words ever could. Finally, he spoke again, his voice softer now. I've been thinking about the kind of life I want to live from here on out. I don't want to go back to the way things were, to the man I used to be. That person doesn't fit me anymore. I've changed, and I want to help others change too. The nurse was struck by the sincerity in his words.
She had seen the moment when he had decided to take control of his life.
But hearing him express it like this with such clarity felt like the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. I think that's a beautiful thing, she said, her voice filled with pride. Helping others change, helping them find their own way. You've been through so much, and now you have the wisdom to help others who are facing challenges of their own. He looked at her, his eyes filled with appreciation. I couldn't have done it without you. I know I said that before, but it's true. You were there for me when I was at my lowest. When I didn't believe in myself, you gave me the space to heal, to think about what really matters. The nurse smiled, her heart full. I just gave you the support you needed to find your way. You did the hard work. You've come so far. They sat together for a while longer, simply talking. It was clear that Mr. Bennett was beginning to find a new sense of purpose, not just for himself, but for others. He was thinking about starting a foundation, something that would focus on helping people who had experienced trauma or setbacks just as he had. He wanted to offer the same kind of support that had helped him heal. I'm thinking of starting a foundation, he said after a long pause, something that can offer support to people who need it, people who are struggling, who feel like there's no way out. I want to help them see that there is always a way forward. The nurse's eyes lit up. That's a fantastic idea. You've been through so much, and now you have the chance to help others who are facing their own battles. Mr. Bennett nodded, his expression one of quiet determination. I think it's the right thing to do. I've learned so much about resilience, about strength. I want to share that with others. The nurse could see the fire in his eyes, the same drive that had once made him a successful businessman, but now tempered with a sense of purpose that was much deeper. It wasn't about building an empire anymore. It was about helping people. And in a way, that made his transformation even more powerful. In the following weeks, Mr. Bennett started putting his plan into motion. He reached out to some of his old contacts, people he had known before the accident, and began discussing his vision for the foundation. The nurse continued to be there for him, supporting him as he took these first steps toward creating something that would not only change his life, but the lives of countless others. The work wasn't easy. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, and plenty of obstacles along the way. But through it all, Mr. Bennett remained focused on his goal. He knew that he had a unique opportunity to make a difference, and he wasn't going to let anything stand in his way. One afternoon, after a particularly challenging meeting with potential donors, Mr. Bennett was feeling frustrated. The process was slower than he had hoped, and he was starting to wonder if he was doing the right thing. The nurse, who had been with him through thick and thin, noticed the change in his demeanor. She could tell he was struggling, and she knew just what to do. You're doing great, she said, her voice calm and reassuring. It's going to take time, but you're making progress. Every step, no matter how small, is a step forward. He looked at her, his face softening. I know it's just hard sometimes, you know. I want to help people so badly, but it feels like everything is moving so slowly. She nodded, understanding his frustration. You've already come so far. Look at how much you've accomplished already. This foundation is going to change lives, and it wouldn't be happening if it weren't for your vision and your perseverance. He smiled, grateful for her support. Thank you. I don't know what I would do without you. The nurse smiled back, her heart full. You don't need me anymore. You found your own strength. You're going to do amazing things. Over time, the foundation began to take shape. Mr. Bennett's vision was becoming a reality, and the impact he was having on people's lives was evident. He had found his purpose, not in the form of financial success, but in the work he was doing to help others. He had discovered that true fulfillment came from giving, from making a difference in the lives of those who needed it most. The nurse, who had watched him every step of the way, felt a deep sense of pride in what he had accomplished. She had always believed in his potential, but now, seeing him truly come into his own was something even more incredible. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest gift you could give someone wasn't a tangible object, but the belief in their ability to change, to grow, and to become the best version of themselves. As Mr. Bennett continued to build his foundation and help others, he never forgot the nurse who had been there for him when he needed it most. She had been his guide, his rock, and the person who had shown him that he could rebuild his life one step at a time, and for that he would be forever grateful.